The Honourable Marion Street.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It grieves me to have to get up and speak to this bill. Here we have it. Here we have it, Mr. Speaker. We have the systematic dismantling of a piece of New Zealand's social fabric which is second to none in the world. The Minister's speech is typical of the way he has been presenting ACC since he had the privilege of taking up that portfolio. He talks in half-truths. He gives half of the information, never the complete information, and he continues to represent ACC, Mr. Speaker, as an insurance scheme and not a social contract. He continues to pretend that this has its equal in the private sector when it does not. He continues to pretend that this second to none, world-class system that began as a worker compensation scheme and developed into something so much more than that for the protection of injured New Zealanders, that he tries to pretend and tries to persuade New Zealanders that this is insurance like every other kind of insurance. It is not. It is not. It is nothing of the sort. It is not charged out at private sector rates. It is in fact, Mr. Speaker, not even charged out or levied, particularly on employers, in any way that is remotely comparable to our nearest neighbour. And I will develop that in a moment. The levies that employers pay in New Zealand for work-related injuries are substantially lower across the board than any comparable scheme in Australia. And we will talk about that further, my colleagues and I. This bill represents the attack on ACC that Minister has been threatening for the last 15 or 16 months. When he took up the portfolio, he responded hysterically to some issues around the increasing costs of treatment and rehabilitation in New Zealand. And what happened in the course of the Minister's misrepresentation of ACC's position was that people began to become concerned until they realised that in fact the Minister's definition of insolvency, which is the main point that he was trying to persuade the New Zealand public of, was based on a tissue of half-truths. And that is the most complimentary way I can describe it, Mr. Speaker, because the definition of insolvent that was used was that the ACC's liabilities exceeded its assets. The total liabilities of ACC exceeded its assets. What the Minister failed to describe to the public was that the calculation of the liabilities was spread over many, many years, over the life of an injury. And that meant that some 30 or 40 years out, there would be residual liabilities. Because we have a scheme, or we had until such time as this law is passed, we have a scheme that covers the life of injuries. It's not just the cost of going to the doctor after one has been injured, but it is whatever it takes to support a person after they have been injured. Then the Minister would repeatedly set that lifetime liability against the current assets, not recognising for a moment the ongoing income from the well-invested funds that ACC gathers from levies from different quarters. Mr. Speaker, the public has been fed a tissue of half-truths around the state of ACC. Certainly there were increases in costs because, Mr. Speaker, we have become better at saving people. Medical science has progressed, and there are cases upon cases where we now save people who would have died otherwise, from motor vehicle accidents, from injuries in the home, from sports injuries, and those people are now able to be saved, whereas some years ago they were not. The Minister never describes that in his description of ACC. He continues to say, untruthfully, that it is broke and it is insolvent. In order to reinforce his point, he appointed a new chair to the ACC board who agreed with his definition. And we heard that definition in select committee at one point shortly after the appointment of the new chair of the ACC, John Judge. Certainly it helps to pick people who will repeat one's own words, obviously, for that minister's benefit. But now, Mr. Speaker, what we have is the peeling back and the dismantling of compassionate human provisions in this legislation that have been put there for good reason and that benefited numbers of people. Mr. Speaker, Labor will oppose every part of this bill with the exception of one part. And that is the bit where the date for the payment of residual levies, that is, the payment of treatment that hasn't been fully funded up until now, which I have to say, Mr. Speaker, derives from the last time the National Party tried to dismantle and privatise ACC. That is why those injuries from pre-1999 are not fully funded, and we are still having to fund them because the provision was not set out for them. They were meant to be fully funded by 2014, and the national government at the time picked 15 years out of the hat. It was an arbitrary number. It could have been 10 years, it could have been 20. They said, "I'll split the difference, we'll make it 15. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are in favour of the pushing out of that date. In fact, I announced it as the previous Minister of ACC, announced it prior to the election, because it became apparent to me, even in only the 12 months that I had in that position, it became apparent to me that something needed to be done about the residual levy payments, and the pressure was building, and it applied pressure to employers, which was not reasonable. The thing that this minister should have done is introduce this bit a year ago. We have lost, and employers have lost, the ability, and car owners have lost, the ability to have reduced levies by the tune of 1 year's worth of levies because of the tardiness of this minister, because of his inability to get past his own hysteria and apply something which we would have agreed with, and it could have happened immediately. It was only in 2008 that the pressure on that residual levies payment component became clear, and that was the only time that the pushing out of the date started to be explored. Mr. Speaker, what we have in this bill is a reflection of a government that has absolutely no respect for the history and the purpose of this social contract. One of the things that becomes really apparent has been in the new apparent as an example of the callous approach that this government is taking is in the Morrison Lowe report to the ACC board, which talks about the need to, quote, significantly cut back to essential and core services, effectively draining the swamp, unquote. Effectively draining the swamp. And now the minister and his government is saying those who benefit from or apply to ACC are no better than swamp dwellers. And so we have the case that was offered earlier in the House, The elderly woman who fell, hurt her shoulder, cannot get any relief from ACC.